Well, thank you very much. And thank you for that nice introduction, Jeff. And I have to tell you right away that I'm unfortunately a walker up here because I can't, of course, stand still and talk at the same time. So I'll be walking in front of the screen, which they always tell you never to do, but I'm afraid I just have to do it. Well, thank you for coming in and listening this evening, because Jeff tells me I have till 9 or 10 o'clock tonight till it gets dark, right? Because we're here till darkness, so we should be good to go. And many of you have been kind enough to hear me speak about topics relating to evolution education in the past. And I think that's an important thing that we do. And it'd be nice if we had all of society listen to these conversations, because here we have the most important scientific theory that has ever been formulated, hands down. The most robust, the most validated, and the least accepted by all of society. In study after study, after survey after survey, we see only about 45% of the US population accepts evolutionary theory as being valid. That should worry us, because we have less than half the nation saying, no, this is good science. And as a scientist, I like to say this is the best that we can offer. As a colleague of mine once said, is that science doesn't get any better than evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory is as good as great science gets, but yet only half of society is willing to accept it as valid science. A quick note in diction, by the way, is that we have to be careful not to say that we believe in evolution, because it's not a faith-based ideology, right? It's science. We either accept the science or we reject the science as being valid. So be careful kind of in that diction and how you choose your words. Is it, do you consider it to be valid science? Well, you think, well, why is it only like 45%, or why is it 55% of the US population is willing to accept it? Well, because we have a lot of misinformation out there. And we have a lot of statements that are made that sometimes people who aren't scientists or educators have a hard time responding to. And as Jeff mentioned, I've been lucky enough to have thousands and thousands of Michigan teachers and teachers from across the US in my seminars on how to teach evolution. And one of the most important things that we do in those seminars, and the teachers say, I think I understand evolutionary theory. In fact, I'm pretty confident I understand it. I'm confident in teaching it. What I am worried about is being able to respond to the questions that my students bring me that are beyond my scope of expertise. Because in science nowadays, you can't possibly have a scope of expertise across all fields. Back in the days of Darwin, you could master scientific knowledge. You can't do that today. You certainly can't. So a lot of teachers we find in the science classroom are actually avoiding the teaching of evolutionary theory because they're just not comfortable responding to some of the questions that they may get from the students. And in fact, those questions that come from the students are the same dirty dozen over and over and over again. And many times they just bring the printout from the anti-evolution webpage and say, excuse me, teacher, and you know it's coming. And what we try and get our teachers used to is recognizing that, yeah, those questions are going to come, and that's okay. Because what are we trying to do as educators? We're trying to produce an environment that's conducive to discourse, where their students feel confident in asking the question in a respectful manner on things that they don't understand or want more information on. So really what we should be doing is fostering an environment, not trying to avoid it in the classroom. So I try and get the teachers to understand that's what you want to do. Get yourself competent enough to answer those questions and encourage the students to ask those questions. But some of these questions come from fields beyond science. In fact, what we see here is that some of these questions that students bring us relate to the nature of science, which most science educators can respond to. But some of them deal with questions about religion and philosophy, which is usually outside that scope of practice. And some of them deal with education and pedagogy. But the point is that it's the same questions over and over again. Many, many years ago, my God, probably back in the Devonian, 1990, some of you folks remember that, 89, at the Skeptic Society, we actually published a little pamphlet called the 25 Responses to Creationist Questions. And they were the same 25 over and over again. And they really haven't changed a whole bunch through the years. So what I want to do tonight is go through some of these and share them with you. Now, there's no way we can have detailed responses to some of these questions. I'll make myself available afterwards, but you'll recognize a whole bunch of these. And I'll bet you some of these you've been wondering, well, how do I respond to that question when my colleague, when my family member, when my neighbor asks me this question? What is the response for that? Because you find out that really, we're not really dancing the hokey pokey up here. Science has the answers, is that we have to just be aware of how to respond to these questions and do so in a manner that's respectful of the person, hopefully, that's asking that question in the same way. And also I want to point out, as I've done for many of my presentations, we're going to use a term tonight which is cumbersome, anti-evolutionist versus creationist. Because if you're a creationist, that nomenclature assumes that if you're a creationist, therefore you reject evolutionary theory. And the Catholics, of course, have absolutely no problem with accepting evolutionary theory, including the evolution of humans. So we'd say that the Pope is a creationist? I'm guessing. Okay, does the Catholic Church not only accept but endorse a strong evolutionary theory education? Oh, absolutely. So it's so cumbersome to say anti-evolutionist, but if we use the other term creationist, it assumes that you don't accept evolutionary theory, and that's not necessarily the case. So what we want to do here is first of all take a look at some questions relating to the nature of science. Okay, and one of the questions we get here commonly is, isn't evolutionary theory unscientific after all? Because science only deals with what can be observed occurring and what's not happened in the past. Therefore, questions about evolution cannot be addressed scientifically. What are they saying here? Doesn't science always have to witness the event, right? Don't you have to see it happening to count as science? And therefore, since you can't see evolution happening, or so they would propose, therefore it falls outside the purview of science. Well, absolutely not, because science isn't limited to observing an unfolding event. In fact, many fields of science, like archaeology, like geology, like paleontology, like cosmology, are actually what? Forensic sciences, aren't they? They're the study of events that have happened in the past, right? What do geologists do? Rarely do you get the opportunity to study geology in action, right? It's studying events of the past. Archaeologists, paleontologists, cosmologists, what? They're studying events that have happened in the past. And you say, well, but that's not the purview of science. Folks, we send people to the gallows and the gas chamber based upon forensic evidence of what we thought happened at the crime scene that nobody was there to witness. We're okay with that, but this whole idea of forensic science throws us off? Of course not. In fact, many fields of science, including many aspects of evolutionary biology, are forensic nature. We don't have to be there to actually see the event. And the analogy I always like to try and bring into this is that how many of you remember your conception in the back of the minivan? Right? Probably very few of you remember that, but I'm just guessing that it happened, right? Aren't you kind of evidence of your conception? Yeah, but you don't remember it firsthand, and hopefully nobody was there to actually see it except the two people involved. So you don't have to be there to understand that these events have actually happened. So science isn't always observational of the event, but it can be observation of the evidence from past events. So for instance, some laws and theories in science can't be observed directly, even in present time. When's the last time you saw gravity? You saw the effects of gravity, and I encourage everybody to do this. Go out and find a cat, okay? Throw a cat up in the air and see what happens. Now, since this is science, do it with every cat you find, okay? And see if you say, I love cats. Tastes like chicken, okay? So don't do it with a pit bull, okay? But what you're seeing there are what? You're seeing the effects of gravity. You're not actually seeing gravity, right? You're seeing the effects of gravity. Have you ever seen a radioisotope actually decay? No, we see the effects of that radioactive decay. How about particle physics? When's the last time you saw an electron? When's the last time you saw a quark? Come on, how about a positron? Right, we don't have pictures, there's a reason, okay? But there's no other way to explain the event, okay? How about black holes? Ever seen a black hole? How about a picture of a black hole? Well, there's a reason you can't take them, because you see light doesn't come out, okay? But there's no other way to explain that event. Evolution. Do you have to see evolution to know that it occurs? No, you don't. But can we see it occur? Sure, we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. Here's another question we commonly get. If evolution really is science, can a controlled experiment be designed to test evolution? Well, the response to that is that contrary to popular belief, and unfortunately the way we teach it, not all science is done with bubbling beakers, white lab coats, horn rimmed glasses, and clipboards. In fact, very little science is done that way. You know, I'm the lowest form of scientist, a biologist, okay? We can hardly control any variables. I envy the physicists, the mathematicians, and the chemists that can control everything. Controlled experiments is not always how science is done. It's kind of the ideal that we move towards. So do we have to have a controlled experiment? We certainly don't. But can we, in studying evolution theory? Well, we absolutely can. Because although science may not be able to always have a controlled experiment, science is able to test hypotheses. So can we test a hypothesis that whales evolved from four-legged ancestors? Yes. And you go, well, nobody was there to see it. We don't have to be. We can look at the evidence in the fossil record. We can test that hypothesis without doing a controlled experiment to have four-legged individuals evolve into whales, right? We can look at the forensic evidence. We also hear from people who say that, you know, science, anti-evolutionists, science has a history of mistaken ideas. You know, you're not always right. You told us about Piltdown Man. You told us that cell membranes were rigid structures. You told us that electrons move in predictable orbits. Oops, we were wrong. So they say, so why should we believe you now? Well, that's a good question, all right? It's an appropriate question. Because an important quality of science is its self-correcting feature, which isn't the case in theology, right? You don't say, okay, sorry about that whole Earth 6,000-year-old thing. Whoops, okay? Doesn't really happen. But what does science do? We always say, here is our interpretation of the data based upon our most valid data set. Can we change our view later on? Yeah. And a lot of times my students go, well, that's a pretty comfortable place to be. You betcha, okay? Exactly, okay? But that's what science does, right? I mean, how many times do you hear any information about diets, right? But here's the big thing, is that have we ever seen a modern scientific theory tossed out because of the new evidence? No. We look at things like atomic theory. Do electrons move in predictable orbits? No. Does that destroy atomic theory? Of course not. Okay? It makes it more powerful. Is the Earth really a static environment? No, it's very dynamic. That makes the science stronger. So is it okay to change view based upon new data? Absolutely. But we're not throwing out scientific theories. We're making them more robust. And we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. So we also have to keep in mind that evolution is a theory. It's not an idea, right? Theory has a very different name in different meaning in science. In science, we say theory is a well-substantiated, what is it? It's a well-substantiated, right? It's not a swag. What's a swag? Scientific wild-ass guess, right? It's not a swag, right? It's a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world that incorporates tested hypotheses, facts, and laws. It's not a wild guess. It's not a hunch. So it has a very different meaning than we use in a colloquial and vernacular and a common-day sense. So it's a theory. It's not an idea or model. Theories are well-established explanations, and the best thing about them is that they're the fruit of science. It's why we do science. Science exists for one reason, to establish scientific theory. Why do we want to establish scientific theory? Because it's predictive, right? It's predictive. It helps us figure out what's going to happen in the world around us. That's why we do it. Folks, if everybody in here uses antibiotics, ad nauseum, what's going to happen to bacterial strains? They'll become what? Resistant. Okay, we can predict that, can't we? Based upon evolutionary theory. We've had viruses. The avian virus jumped from avians to pigs, from pigs to humans, and now what's our next mutation? From humans to humans. It's predictive, right? And that's why we do scientific theory. It's the fruit of what science is. Here's another question we get. If science has all the answers, then where did the material from the Big Bang come from? And where did space come from? I have to stop for a musical interlude. First of all, who said that science has all the answers? Science can't address all questions. I've said in this venue before that there are three traditional forms of human inquiry. We have theology, we have philosophy, and we have science. They're all valuable forms of human inquiry, but they all operate by different rules. They're bound by different requirements. And science is bound by empiricism. That's a huge monkey on your empirical back that you have to deal with. So can science address all questions? Can science address whether there's life after death? It's not testable, is it? Can we address the question whether there's a God? Not testable. So that goes to who? The philosophers, the theologians. So do we ever say that science can address all questions? It absolutely can't. But science is especially unprepared to look at those ultimate cause type questions. What is our purpose? Is that a scientific question or a theological philosophical? It's a theological philosophical question, right? It's not a question for the scientist. But we run into a bit of an issue here, for instance, in this question right here, is that if you say, well, can science tell us where the Big Bang happened? In space. Where did space come from? Yeah, it was always there. Where did there come from? From the beginning of time? Oh, where did time come from? I need to go now, okay? But this is the chicken and the egg thing, isn't it? Because don't the theologians suffer from the same thing? Where was your deity when your deity created the universe? In space. Where did space come from? The deity created it. Where was the deity when the deity created it? There. Where did there come from? There was there since the beginning of time. Where did time come from? I have to go now. Okay? They both suffer from that same little dilemma, don't they? So science cannot, nor should it pretend to address all questions. We get that. Because although it's unexplained by science, it doesn't mean that it's inexplicable, right? And this is an important concept. Because just because science can't explain it today doesn't mean we're not going to be able to in the future. At one point, we couldn't explain rainbows. We can do that now. We couldn't explain earthquakes. We can do that now. We couldn't explain seasons. We can do that now. But what did primitive, uneducated people do? They inserted what? A God into the gap of knowledge, right? It's called God of the Gaps Fallacy, is that we can't explain it, therefore, ergo, It must be a god. It must be a deity. And this is also called the fallacy of false alternatives. If we say science can't explain it, therefore, ergo, the anti-evolutionists would like you to believe what's the reason for everything? A deity of some sort, right? And that's a fallacy of false alternatives. Maybe there's another option. So unexplained doesn't mean inexplicable. Just because science can't explain something today doesn't mean we won't be able to in the future. Let's look at some questions relating to scientific knowledge, though, in detail here. Very commonly, our students, your neighbors, your friends will say, well, wait a minute. This whole chimpanzees giving rise to humans thing, I have a question for you there. If species actually increase in complexity over time, if they become more complex from their primordial ooze, quote unquote, then why are there still extant primitive forms? Extant is the opposite of extinct. Extinct means no longer with us. Extant means currently living on the planet. So the question here is, and you commonly phrase different ways, if humans evolved from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees? Well, first of all, we're not saying humans evolved from chimpanzees. They share a common ancestor. But maybe this can be put in a different context. Species don't necessarily increase in complexity over time. We know sponges and corals and anemones have been around for hundreds of millions of years. Why haven't they evolved into the person sitting next to you? Because they're really good at being sponges, anemones, and corals, right? Good enough, right? They don't necessarily evolve into great more complexity. Probably a good example here is we take a look at ancestral taxa, groups, old phyla, class, genus, species, don't necessarily disappear because they give rise to a new form. The most abundant vertebrate on the planet are the fishes. Depending on who you believe, we have 35 to 40,000 species of fishes. Fishes, we're going to tell you, gave rise to the amphibians. Amphibians gave rise to the reptiles. So the question comes, well, wait a minute. If the fishes gave rise to the amphibians, and there are amphibians on the planet, I've seen frogs in my pond, there are still fishes. What's up with that? Okay, I thought the fishes turned into amphibians. Did all of the fishes give rise to amphibians? A very small group called the lobe-finned fishes gave rise. The other 99.9% of the fishes on the planet spent their time evolving into better adapted what? Fishes, right? Better adapted fishes, exactly. Okay? So just because we have an increased complexity doesn't mean the ancestral groups disappear. Oh, here we go. Okay? If dinosaurs and humans weren't contemporaries, because the anti-evolutionists are going to tell you that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and we know there were dinosaurs, so we've got a math problem. Okay? Clearly they lived together at some point. So if they weren't contemporaries, they didn't live together at the same time, then why, I ask you, why are there human footprints and dinosaur footprints together at Paluxy River, Texas? You guys heard about these before? This is kind of an old standard. Now, most of the anti-evolutionist websites have said, please don't bring this one up anymore. Okay? Let's put that one in the back burner. In 1938, in the Paluxy River, which is by a little pueblo called Glen Rose, Texas, Roland Bird, the American Museum of Natural History, unearthed a sequence here of footprints, which we see on the left-hand side. This is actually the Paluxy River on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, this is what it looks like during the dry period. And that's Roland there in the trench on the left-hand side. And so what he discovered was a whole series of what appeared to be really unusual dinosaur footprints that appeared to be side by side with human footprints. This is all the evidence. This is the end of the discussion for the anti-evolutionists. They say, therefore, ergo, side by side, therefore, they were together at the same time. End of story. Any questions? Well, yeah, we do have some, okay? If you go to this website here, bible.ca, where I get most of my science, you'll see here some pictures of a variety of these tracks right here. And they're displaying, for instance, a gentleman on the bottom right-hand side. He's pointing to one of the human footprints. And then in the sequence where the gentleman is walking right over here, we see what appears to be human footprints here and then dinosaur footprints here in the same age strata. Ooh, there's a brain scratcher. What are we going to do? As we always say, another great hypothesis destroyed by the data, unless we look at the data a little more closely. I'm going to show you some of this is from, once again, the same website, and many are like this. What do some of these footprints look like? Here is what is supposed to be a human footprint. Now, granted, it's weathered for a long period of time. There are little tadpoles in it. There's some water in it. So they're kind enough to clean it up for you on the website. And they take the water out, and they Photoshop it a little bit for you, just in case you had not seen what you think you'd be seeing. Did you guys see a human footprint yet? They help you out later on the website. So here's your first picture on the left-hand side. That's the next one. So they're, quote-unquote, color enhancing it with Photoshop. Footprint yet? You guys just aren't making very good scientists here. Let me help you out again. Oh, there it is. Okay, yeah. If it had been a snake, it bit you. Okay, so there we have the human footprint that appears to be right in the center of the dinosaur footprint. So here's our human footprint, here's the dinosaur footprint, or so that would be their interpretation, replete with the toes there. So you think, wow, that's a little hard to explain there. What's going on here? Well, they Photoshop it a little more in case you couldn't see it in the first one. On the right-hand side, you're convinced by now, that's a pretty good footprint. That looks like mine. Okay, well, it begs some questions. The human prints are actually not human prints, but they're impressions from a small theropod. Theropods you see on the left-hand side here, these gave rise to the birds. You know Archaeoraptor? Theropod. And then sauropods, which you probably know on the right-hand side is brachiosaurs, brontosaurs. You say, well, saying it so doesn't make it so. Well, that's true. Okay, that would be another Kipling just so story. So maybe we need some more evidence, because one side is saying they're human footprints, we're saying no, they're just sauropods. Well, let's take a look. Here's the problem with their data. The heels of the human prints show claw marks in some impressions. So see these claw marks right here? So these are supposed to be 3 human footprints side by side. Somebody isn't trimming their nails, okay? So a bit of an issue there. So maybe they just wear funky Birkenstocks or something like that, okay? So maybe we need some more information. Well, in one series of prints, the human, quote unquote, and the dinosaur tracks alternate left and right. So there's a problem. So we have dinosaur, human, dinosaur, human, dinosaur. That's a little hard to explain what's going on there unless they're both doing hopscotch. So maybe there's another way to explain this. A way of looking at this is that humans don't appear in the geologic strata anywhere on this planet in the age of the Paluxy strata. The Paluxy strata are about 107 million years old. If in fact there were humans on the planet at that point, shouldn't we be able to go somewhere on the planet and look at strata that's old and find some indication of human activity? But we don't. In fact, the latest fossils we'll see are separated by about 100 million years. The next human fossils we find anywhere on the planet, hominid fossils, excuse me, are about 100 million years later. So what happened to those people for 100 million years? Just hiding their dead? It would lead us to indicate that probably our early interpretation of those as being human footprints probably wasn't accurate. Is there some more information? Sure. Had humans and dinosaurs coexisted anywhere on the planet, at any time, shouldn't somewhere in the strata we have human and dinosaur remains side by side, or in the same age strata? But we don't. So the evidence clearly points that these, in fact, were not human and dinosaur footprints. They were just a sauropod and a brachiopod, because both the dinosaur and human prints are sunken to almost the same depth also. That would make it one very tall person. We've all stood in, the state rock of Michigan, muck, okay? We've all stepped into a pond or the mud and you just kind of sink down, proportional to your weight, don't you? When we look at the dinosaur on the right and the human footprints, they're sunken down to about the same depth, suggesting that one is probably not a heavy-bodied individual and the other light like humans. How would you explain that? And how would you explain this next issue here, the stride marks? When you look at the human stride marks, they're too far apart to be made by even the tallest human. I'm 5'16". I couldn't pull that off, okay? So, could you have, a basketball player do that? No. So you look at the fact the stride marks are too wide, the impressions are too deep, they're as deep as the other dinosaurs, the claw marks are there, the fossils don't appear anywhere else on the planet at the same age. It kind of leads to one scientific conclusion, that those are not human footprints. So how do the anti-evolutionists explain this very wide stride? How do they explain the very deep footprints? It's easy. What's the answer? Humans were taller back then, okay? Humans were taller, okay? In fact, they were 10 feet tall, apparently. So they were 10 feet tall, and that's how you account for the stride mark. And in the Great Noachian Flood, that's how you account from them running in the same place, because the dinosaurs and the humans were running away from the flood of Noah, the Noachian Flood. That's one interpretation. It's just not a scientific interpretation. But, and this is, I'm not trying to lampoon their view. I'm saying this is from their websites. I'm just saying this is their belief, and that's what it is. It's not based upon science. So we'd say, well, science doesn't support your interpretation. But the Creation Science Museum does, okay? If you go to the Creation Science Museum in North Kentucky, they have displays, and we have the light pollution in here, so this is very difficult to see. But on the right-hand side, there's a diorama of a sauropod and a cave woman sitting there with beautifully coiffed hair, down, skinning a pterodactyl or something, living side by side, because apparently in the Garden of Eden they lived harmoniously. In fact, at the Creation Science Museum, you can even ride a triceratops, because apparently they were tamed back then also. So one interpretation, this is an attempt to what? To make 4.6 billion years of Earth history fit into 6,000 to 10,000 years. Okay? Another question you get, how can a complex structure or organism evolve by chance? You hear this a lot, right? How can something as complex as the human eye, possibly evolve by random chance? That's not an unfair question. You hear it worded another way. Sometimes you say, okay, well, what's the probability that when all the parts in a junkyard are thrown up into the air, upon landing they form a 747? That would be extraordinary, okay, wouldn't it? Here's another one you get. These come in different phases. It's the same question. I love this one. My students read this one off. I go, okay, I know where you're going. A simple organism consists of only 100 parts. Theoretically, could they combine these parts into 10 to the 158 possible ways? Okay, I don't do math. Okay, I had to marry my way out of calculus. Okay, how is it even possible that the right combination could occur in a simple animal, let alone in complex organisms like humans? The point is, even if you had a simple organism with 100 parts, how could it work out correctly, right? Just by random chance. Well, probably an infinitesimal chance. The last way this is worded, and this is probably the most common, what's the probability that a monkey sitting at a keyboard and randomly hitting keys could type a work of Hamlet? The statisticians will be happy to generate a number for you, okay? But is it realistic probability? Well, here's what the point is missing. Natural selection doesn't work by chance, but genetic variation does. If we understand biology, genetic variation is a completely random process. It is a complete roll of the genetic dice. But acting upon that randomness of genetic mutation is a very non-random process called natural selection. So is evolution based upon complete randomness? No, it's based upon complete randomness of genetic mutations, but a very non-random event called natural selection decides whether those mutations are adaptive for this environment at this time. And so it's not a completely random process. It's a very non-random selection that occurs there. Since mutations are harmful, the question is usually posed, to the gene pool, how can mutations be the driving force of evolution? And you see mutations like this. Here's a two-faced cat, like there's any other kind, and a two-headed snake, and the five-legged lamb and things like that. And that's actually my cat on the left-hand side. Somebody brought it for me. I have it in my office, and it's kind of cute there, 4 eyes, 2 noses, eats a lot more. But the question here is, if these are mutations, is this beneficial? Well, this assumes that all mutations are going to be negative, right? And not all mutations are negative, because they can be negative, which means, well, we just saw some. They could be neutral. A mutation, and all of you have one in your body, don't you? Your right one doesn't quite match your left one, right? There's something that's a little different, but unless it breaks that intimate moment, prevents you from reproducing, it's not a negative adaptation, is it? It may be neutral, or could it be positive? Could you have a species that evolves a mutation, or has a mutation that gives it an advantage over all its conspecifics? Yes. So what people who are asking this question don't understand is that randomness of genetic mutations can be positive, can be neutral, can be beneficial. They're not just negative. Okay, here's some examples of negative mutations. On the left-hand side, there's Gary Larson, bummer of a birthmark, Hal. Okay, that would be bad, okay? Or the polka dot, polar bear, hard to sneak up on seals. But clearly there could be beneficial mutations, okay? And it's the positive mutations that drive evolution, right? Changes occur in the gene pool that drive evolution are positive mutations, like these. Okay, so yes, they're photoshopped, okay? I showed these once to a group of teachers. Those are photoshopped, aren't they? Get back to me on that. I won't enable that thought process, okay? If evolution did occur, why aren't there transitional forms in the fossil record? Which is to say what? This is what's called this is a situation you get into where it's called an infinite regression. If you have fossil 1 and fossil 10, the skeptics are going to say, give me fossil 5. So now we have fossil 1, 5, and 10. They go, well, where's fossil 3 and 7? So we find 1, 3, 5, 7, and 10. They go, well, where's fossil 2? We can't find it. Ah. Well, we know that the fossil record is a very incomplete thing. When we look at the literally, possibly hundreds and hundreds of millions of species that have ever lived on the planet over time. In all the world's museums, we only have records of about 250 million species, not individual fossils, 250 million species, which means your chance of becoming fossilized and discovered are pretty slim, aren't they, okay? So are we ever gonna have the entire fossil sequence? No, but we don't need to. Some of you may have heard me use this analogy of Moby Dick before, with reference to the fossil record. How many folks have read Moby Dick? Okay, some of you have read Moby Dick, the others are just literature impoverished, okay? So we probably know what's the first sentence in Moby Dick. They call me Ishmael. So now we know who really raised their hand and who really read it. Half you guys were lying. Okay, so if you read Moby Dick, okay, and you say, okay, what if we give you Moby Dick and we tear out every even-numbered chapter? We tear out chapter 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. You've never read Moby Dick before, and now you read it for the first time. By the time you read it with every other chapter missing, don't you get the idea that there's like a really angry white whale? There are some really bad sailors. One guy has a peg leg, and there's a big duel, and there's a guy named Ishmael who's a primary character. They go back and forth. Who wins? The whale. What's the whale's name? Moby Dick. Okay, now, do you get the general theme of the story? Sure. Do you miss some of the nuance of the character development? Sure. But don't you now, reading every other chapter, don't you get the Moby Dick story? Yeah, folks, the fossil record is Moby Dick with every other chapter missing. We don't need every chapter. We get it. The story is perfectly clear, right? So we don't have to have all the fossils. And you say, well, then you should have transitional forms, you know. Where are they all? There's no shortage of them, folks. Is that the fossil record has a ton of these, what you probably know as missing species. Many of the missing species aren't missing. They're at your local museum. They're at your local university. The whole field of paleontology does what? Finds these. There is no shortage of transitional forms. We unfortunately hold up as our poster children far too often a couple of our old favorites, but there are no shortages of transitional forms. The fossil record is complete from that perspective as that we understand the story. Will we ever have all of the forms? Absolutely not. Nature's brutal. It doesn't hang on to those fossils. But there are also many extant transitional forms. On the left-hand side, and unfortunately we have the light pollution in here, on the left-hand side there's an animal called a coelacanth, which is one of the ancestors that gave rise to amphibians, still with us today. And then the platypus, what's up with that? Okay, you know, is it a reptile or is it a mammal? Yeah, okay, it lays eggs, reptile. It has scales, reptile. It has fur, mammal. It has a duckbill, next. Okay, does it have mammary glands? No, but it sweats milk. Ooh, work on that one. Okay, so what is it? Okay, it's not confused. We would expect these to be there, right? So we should have these forms that are transitional between those that we recognize. So when people say you have no fossils, oh my God, you know, how long do you have? A Ph.D. in paleontology would help that out quite a bit. Here's one that I love. Population statistics show that at the present rate of population increase, there were only 2 people living 6,300 years ago. Who were those 2 people? Adam and Eve. Which begs the initial question, why does Eve have a belly button? You work on it, okay? Now, was that considered fondling back then or just helping her pick apples? Okay, but anyway, but I digress, okay? So, and who did Adam and Eve's cherry? Who did Adam and Eve's children reproduce with? Okay, but I'm off topic, okay? Let's get back here. We have our 2 people, and they say, well, this shows that the Earth is only 6,000 years old because population statistics show that at the present rate of population increase, if you go backwards, there were only 2 people 6,000 years ago. Okay, and here's what they continue to say. Well, if the Earth really is old, as you scientists say, let's say just 1 million years old to keep the numbers nice and easy rather than 4.6 billion. This means there would have already been 25,000 generations, even at a modest rate of 0.5% increase per year. Mostly when you get this in the classroom, most teachers, there's a little puddle forming up there because there are numbers flying at you and you're kind of going, okay, okay, and you get this, you go, oh, okay, I know the question that's coming. By now, most people are lost. You're saying, I don't know. Well, let's take a look. And they continue on and saying at 2.5 children per couple, the present rate of increase in the US, their current population would be 10 to the 2,100, which is impossible since there are only 10 to 130 electrons in the known universe. At that point, the first time I got this, I went, okay, I give, cut the jugular here, okay? But you say, well, okay, well, let's take a second and look at this, right? Let's look at the numbers, okay? What they're saying there is, therefore, aren't the Earth and humans actually quite young? You can't say it's 4.6 billion years old, otherwise there would be more people than there are electrons in the universe. I don't know how one measures electrons, but apparently there are people who count electrons, okay? Well, my buddy, my favorite, Mark Twain, said there are three types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics, okay? And this is what they're throwing at you here. I also love his other quote, is that the truth is the most precious commodity. Let us conserve it wisely. So when you see the numbers here, you think, well, it must be true. Well, here's some problems with their statement or their question. It turns out that populations don't increase at a constant rate. They're always going to be what? Periods of stasis where there's relatively little change. You're going to have periods of population explosion. You'll have periods of population crash. And does that always average out to a constant rate of increase? Of course it doesn't. What happened, for instance, we take a look over here, look at the Black Death. In fact, look what happened until the development of agriculture. Well, look at the human population. It wasn't a constant rate of increase. Look what happened with agriculture. Geez Louise, okay? We started reproducing like, well, I'm thinking bunnies, okay? Because we had a constant source of food. So their first assumption that populations increase at a constant rate is a fallacy. So it invalidates the rest of their statement. But what happens if, in fact, we were to use their data? Let's go ahead and use their data and just use what they do and calculate it for them, which is what I had to do, go home and get my calculator out, okay? That would mean if we used their data, that in 2600 BC, there would only been 600 people on Earth. I'm not thinking these are the 600 people because that guy has a briefcase, that person has a skirt, but hey, I was trying to do clip art, okay? So if you use their numbers and extrapolate back from the number of people today, that means that in 2600 BC, there were only 600 people on Earth. That's a problem, because at 2600 BC, if you know your history, there were already flourishing civilizations in what? Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, Egypt, China. So, if we go back and look, could 600 people have been responsible for all those civilizations at that time? That's a particular problem when you get to Europe. Or to Egypt. That means that even if Egypt had 25% of the world population back then, only 150 people built all the pyramids. That's a long day. So even if we were to take their data, it just doesn't hold water. But a lot of teachers at that point fold and go, I just don't know how to calculate this. So once again, three types of lies, right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. Because there are numbers associated, doesn't mean it's true. Here's another one we commonly get. Doesn't the second law of thermodynamics prove that evolution is impossible? Evolutionists say that the universe and life moves from chaos to order, from simple to complex, the exact opposite of the second law. Now, I know that all of you have on the tip of your mental tongue the two laws of thermodynamics, but just for the young girl in the front, the infant in the back who doesn't know it, okay? The two laws of thermodynamics: energy can't be created nor destroyed. This is pretty zen. You almost need a toga and a yak and be drinking yak fat to think about this, but energy can't be created or destroyed. Number two, physical systems tend to proceed toward a state of greater disorder or entropy, which means that organization doesn't increase over time in the law of thermodynamics. So what they're suggesting to you is, doesn't evolution, if you biologists say that organisms continue to become more complex over time, that there's greater order over time, doesn't that violate the second rule of thermodynamics? Well, I would speculate that the whole creation story would be a greater violation of the second law of thermodynamics when you think about it. But let's take a look here. We all know entropy, right? Look at a teenager's room, right? It starts with order and degenerates into chaos, doesn't it, okay? And this is kind of that second law of thermodynamics. But let's take a look here. Here's the ringer. The second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems with no energy input. Do we have energy input into planet Earth? We do, the sun. End of discussion, no further discussion needed. That evolution does not violate the second law, because the second law doesn't apply to biology on the planet because we have energy input. Life doesn't necessarily also evolve, as we've already talked about, from simple to complex. Ask your local sponge, okay? Now, is that the general theme in the evolutionary record? Sure, but does it always happen? No. Ask your local T-Rex. Well, gee, they're not here. Well, if they were getting better adapted, you think they'd be here selling something to you, okay? Isn't it true that nobody has ever actually seen a new species during their lifetime? Because this is when you get a lot, right? I said, well, wait a minute. If evolution's true, you should be able to see it happen. Well, we've already talked about the fact that, no, you don't have to see it happen, right? Because a lot of science is forensic in nature. But does that mean that we haven't seen new species evolve? No, it doesn't. In fact, it's very common in plants. You can see in a single generation in nature reproductively isolated offspring from the parent stock. If you can't produce fertile offspring with your immediate ancestors, you're what? A separate species. And I won't bore you with the details of how this happens. If you folks have had biology, what happens is you're familiar with Down syndrome in humans, trisomy 21, where one of the chromosomes isn't segregated correctly into one of the daughter cells. What happens in plants is entire sets of chromosomes go over, and you wind up like right here. We have what should happen in something called meiosis. If we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each of these gametes should have 3 each. But we can wind up with 6 and wind up with offspring that have 12 chromosomes. That's fatal in animals. It's not in plants. It's very common. Can you see in nature a reproductively unique species in a single generation in your lifetime? Oh, absolutely. That's what corn does all the time. It's what wheat does. It's what rice does. It's very common. You say, well, yeah, but it's not a monkey. Didn't say it was, okay? But remember, evolution doesn't just happen in animals. It happens in all life forms, doesn't it? Here's one you get. If evolution is a gradual process, then how can there be gaps in species, right? If in fact we have, if as Darwin said, evolution occurs continuously and gradually, then why in the fossil record do we see, for instance, species A, or number 1, species 5 and 10? Where are all the intermediaries? Because does evolution always happen gradually? Prior to 1972, we thought, well, yeah, Darwin was probably right. But for you folks who study science and read, you may know about Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, who in the early 70s proposed something called punctuated equilibrium, the most cumbersome term to describe rapid changes in the genome of an organism. Back when they proposed this, we had no idea how to explain the biology. We knew the fact that it happened, but how to explain it from a genetic standpoint was a different situation. Some of you may know about homeotic genes or Hox genes. We now know how to explain it. So can you have rapid changes in a short period of time? Yeah. We know how to account for some of those gaps in the fossil record. Another question you get is, wouldn't partially evolved structures be of no value to an organism? What's the question here? The question is, what value is half of an eye, right? Evolved eye. If in fact natural selection selects for the features that we love so much in humans, our eyes, our hearts, etc., of what value is half an evolved eye? The wings in beetles, of what value is half a wing? Well, first of all, that conjures up what? A wing that's half as long, a wing that's half as wide. But in reality, let's take a look at a couple other examples. Take a look at the wing. You say, well, you know, birds, by the way, we know birds used to be in the class Aves. They're now back into their original home, which is class Reptilia. They're a separate group of reptiles. Don't let that wig you out too much. We've all seen Jurassic Park, right? Remember Archaeoraptor? That's the group that gave rise to today's birds. Okay? In fact, they even kind of run like goofy little roadrunners, don't they? Okay? So you say, what value is half a wing? Would half a wing be of any value for flight? No. Would it be a value for gliding? Yes. Would it be a value for balancing? Yes, it would. So these are called incipient structures, structures that may have a different value on their way to possibly evolving into other structures. Because what the anti-evolutionists want you to believe, well, you evolutionists say that eyeballs appeared on a Monday morning. No, we're not saying that. Well, it's Sunday night. There was half an eye. No. Let's take a look here. Okay, if I gave you the option to say, would you rather be completely blind or would you rather just see light versus dark? What would your option be? Light versus dark. Wouldn't that confer survival value to do in the wild? If you were lower on the food chain, wouldn't it be better to see light versus dark versus no vision at all? Sure. If I now gave you the option to see black and white silhouettes versus just light and dark, what would you go for? Black and white silhouettes. If I gave you an option to see black and white silhouettes or black and white detail, what would you go for? Black and white detail. If I gave you an option to see color detail or black and white detail, what would you go for? Color detail. Didn't every one of these steps along the way confer another type of survival value to you? Sure. Didn't it keep you from becoming lunch, falling in the tar pits, etc.? So when they say what value is half an eye, what do you conjure up? An eyeball cut in half, right? Okay. Well, I guess if you put two of them together, you'd be okay. No, okay. But what we see here are these structures in flatworms today. Flatworms planaria, they see light versus dark. That's good. It keeps you from being on the wrong side of a leaf where the predators are going to get you. And we can see today in extant species all these steps of the evolution of an eye, which at least evolved probably a dozen different times in different forms of animals. But did each step along that way confer some survival advantage? Sure. So you say, what value is half an eye? Well, half an eyeball rolling on the ground, probably very good, but a structure evolving towards the eye is of great benefit, isn't it? Isn't the stratification in the fossil record actually a result of hydrodynamic sorting? Stay tuned. And therefore, doesn't it actually represent the appearance of new life forms over time? Many times you'll hear the anti-evolutionists say, well, you know what? The Grand Canyon was actually formed during Noah's flood, the Noachian flood, and it happened in, a week. Don't even bother with that conversation. Say, okay, that's not what's important. Is it how the Grand Canyon got there? Is what does it show? What it exposes is this beautiful lineage of the youngest strata at the top, the more recently evolved forms, and as we go down deeper to the older strata, the original ancestral forms. That's the value of the Grand Canyon. So what the anti-evolutionists say, well, no, you guys are reading this wrong. Okay, what you're actually seeing here is not the evolution of life forms from early forms to more modern forms. What you're seeing is hydrodynamic sorting. You guys probably read about this a lot, so I don't even need to tell you what hydrodynamic sorting is, right? So want me to move on? Hydrodynamic sorting says that as the Noachian flood occurred, the animals that had greater locomotion ability were able to flee the rising floodwaters longer than those who didn't have locomotion ability. So the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians got caught up here in the floodwaters and the sediments, whereas the lower forms that didn't have the locomotion ability, the corals, the sea anemones, got stuck down here. That's what accounts for simple to complex. Any questions? Okay? It begs a few questions, doesn't it? Okay? If hydrodynamic sorting did occur, somewhere on their planet, shouldn't there be interstratic contaminants? So if in fact the horses were entombed at the top because they were running away from the floodwaters, shouldn't you have had some stupid horse somewhere that broke its leg next to a trilobite, okay, and got buried next to a trilobite? You would think. How about some stupid lizard that ran the wrong way? Instead of going up, went down and drowned in its reptilian futility. It doesn't happen, does it? There are no interstratic contaminants. Why do turtles occur in all of the strata? From the Mesozoic. When you look at the Grand Canyon, turtles, the most important animal in the world, which I did my research on, so moment of silence, okay. So turtles, have appeared a long way. Wait a minute, why do they have to get entombed at all? Because don't they swim? Okay, so why would they be entombed? And how about those fishes? Why are the primitive fishes found in the bottom of the strata? After all, don't they have gills? Why would they drown at all? And how about those trilobites? Why down at the bottom? They have gills. And here's a troubling one. Oh, those pterodactyls. Shouldn't the pterodactyls have been able to flee to the last minute? But we don't see any pterodactyls buried next to the mammals, do we? Because they weren't around at the time. So is it a good explanation? No, it's not. And also, what if we throw Noah into there? What if Noah had been a vegetarian? How about those zucchini? This is from an Ann Arbor artist, okay? Because we always tend to talk about animals, right? Because it's a point of reference. Wouldn't the same thing be true for plants? If we go back and look at the Grand Canyon, why do we find the mosses and liverworts in the oldest strata and the flowering plants in the most modern strata? And sandwiched in between, you have the bryophytes, the ferns, the conifers, the angiosperms, because you know what? The plants have the exact same stratification as the animals, from simple to complex. Does that mean that the angiosperms were better at running away from the fleeing floodwaters? Okay? Their response is, well, no, they had propagules and seeds that were able to float. And fern spores do what? Okay, there's just no sense. So if we throw the vegetarian Noah in there, still, their explanation doesn't hold water. We commonly hear, well, aren't homologous structures proof of intelligent design? What's a homologous structure? These are structures that have the same form and function in different species of organisms. In this case, we can take a look at this one here, commonly used. Here we have the humerus of mammals, human, cat, bat, porpoise, horse. And we see them over here, and same thing in the bird, the pterodactyl, and today's modern fruit bat. Why do these all have the same structures? And they say, well, that's because an intelligent designer designed this limb as the perfect limb, and it's been conserved through there, really, okay? That's not a very intelligent designer, okay? Because would you ever design a limb like that? I mean, here's an amazing demonstration. Maybe some of you have seen it before, so I don't know if your heart can take this twice in a row, but I can only do it once. Are you ready? Now in reverse. There we go. Isn't that amazing? That's a 360 joint. It's the only one in your body. Does your leg do that? if you were designing a limb from the bottom up for maximum flexibility, endurance, like in today's robots, wouldn't you make them all 360, right? How about if you did that with like a cat, okay? I'm just kidding, Sarah's gonna write me bad notes here. Sarah's gonna write me notes. You know, if you did that with a cat, right, would it work? Not the first time, okay? So I'm just kidding. Okay, Sarah, I live with 2 cats. I actually do, okay? They're not mine, but okay. But anyway, so what we see right here is actually not the best design, it's design that's good enough. When that tetrapod appendage evolved in the fishes, it was conserved. The scientific explanation would be that this represents a common ancestor for all vertebrates. This doesn't represent the best way to design a limb by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Here's one I had to add over dinner. There was a request. You hear this a lot. Didn't Darwin recant his view of evolution upon his deathbed? How many of you guys have heard this one? You know what the answer is? Who cares? So, next question. What if he did? Okay, which there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that he did. It doesn't matter. It's not about Darwin, is it? Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for the science. We're way past you, Chuck, okay? We appreciate what you've done for us. You've changed the way we look at the world, but our evidence is not based upon Darwin's 1800s biology. We've gone way beyond that. So even if he did recant, it doesn't matter. It's a moot point. These are called ad hominem attacks, aren't they, right? Attack the professor, attack the man saying it. It's an independent point. It doesn't matter if he did or not, because the science validates the theory. Questions relating to religion and philosophy, okay? Isn't evolutionary theory actually nothing more than just a religious belief of scientists? You hear this, don't you? A lot. Yeah, good question, and let's hope that our students ask that. Well, let's take a look. Science has to be guided by natural law, not supernatural intervention. Intelligent design and religion is guided by what? Supernatural intervention. And that's okay. It's just a different way of looking at how to explain the world around us. Science explains what is observed with reference to natural laws. Intelligent design and religion explains what is observed with reference to supernatural intervention. You can see these are diametrically polarized approaches to explaining nature. Science is testable against the empirical world. ID religion is rarely testable against the empirical world. Can we test the theological position that females have one more rib than males? Is that testable? Yes, it is. We just look at skeletons. But usually it's not testable. In science, conclusions are tentative. But in religion, conclusions are final. In science, all statements have to be potentially falsifiable. In religion, rarely testable and therefore usually not falsifiable. So what we see is that science and religion are diametrically opposite forms of human inquiry, addressing the same question possibly, but doing so very differently. And here's the most important and germane difference. Science asks a question and then seeks to find an answer. Religion usually does what? Provides an answer and seeks to find proof, which is what intelligent design creationism does. Isn't it true that the agenda of the scientific community is that of destroying religion? Well, of course not, because science is, remember, only one form of human inquiry, and it's limited by empiricism. Can science address the question by testing the hypothesis that there is a God? No, it's an untestable hypothesis. That there's life after death? No, it's an untestable hypothesis. So that question doesn't fall in the purview of science. That goes to the theologians and the philosophers. So trying to learn more about the natural world around us is not chipping away at theology or philosophy. But however, in the interest of science literacy, is it incumbent upon us as scientists and as educators to refute pseudoscientific claims? Do you just say, oh, well, you know them? Well, as we've seen by the data I opened up the talk with, 45% of the US population does not accept evolutionary theory as being valid science. So passiveness doesn't get us very far as educators. Another question we get here, science can't explain many of the intricate structures and processes found in nature. Therefore, doesn't it seem reasonable that they were intelligently designed? This gets back to that two things, the God of the gaps we talked about and the fallacy of false alternatives. If science can't yet explain it, therefore, ergo, it must be some form of deity, some form of God. Well, no, Because in fact, natural selection does provide a well-validated explanation of how complex structures arrive. Commonly you see that there's someone by the name of Behe, Dr. Behe, who says, well, how does science explain the evolution of the bacterial flagellum, the vertebrate eye, the blood clotting system? We've got you. What would you like to know? Saying that it can't be explained doesn't mean it isn't inexplicable, and if it is unexplained, does that mean that it will always be inexplicable? No, it doesn't. In fact, if an intelligent designer was really in control of our bodies, for instance, I teach human anatomy and physiology. Anybody who wants to see the most unintelligently designed thing should look at the human body. Would you ever build your body like this from the ground up? Okay? Wouldn't you like to have the speed of a cheetah? Wouldn't you like to have the olfactory ability of a dog, the eyesight of an eagle, the tactilization of a primate? But look what you got. Jeez, okay? You know, simply looking at the female reproductive tract, there's an exercise in disaster, okay? A little bit of connective tissue would have stopped endometriosis, ectopic pregnancies, would have stopped pelvic inflammatory disease, you name it, the list goes on. That's not a good design. Sorry, ladies, nothing personal. It's a little bit of duct tape will take care of that. And as we've talked about, wouldn't just having a 360 appendage, a joint in every appendage be a better design? Sure. Let's take a look in concluding here. Questions relating to education and pedagogy. And here's one that sometimes is hard to refute. Shouldn't parents be in control of what is taught in the classroom? Depends where you are and how old your kids are, right? Yeah. In grades 1 through 6, parents in there all the time. After like, heck, we have other kids. How much harm can they do? So, you know, we look at, well, do you really want to be in control? Well, probably not, okay? Because it turns out that the scholarship in any field, let's talk college now, high school, etc. The scholarship in any field should be determined by what? The scholars, the academics, the researchers in that field, and not by the parents. Well, when my son had, you know, pre-Columbian art history, you know, I didn't dare call up the professor and say, you know, here's how I want you to cover the pre-Columbian period, okay, up to the Aztec Toltecs, okay? What do I know about Columbian art history? An example I've given before, you know, our college president won't allow me to teach quantum mechanics physics. And that's a good thing for all involved, because what do I know about quantum mechanics physics? Not a whole bunch. So who is it that determines the scholarship? It's the scholars and the academics in the field, it's not the parents. And the scientific community has determined that evolutionary theory, and only evolutionary theory, is the acceptable scientific explanation of the life that we see on the natural world. Since creation science is scientific, shouldn't it be taught in public schools? We know about this from the Dover case that this group has talked about before, the Dover, Pennsylvania case, where the book on the right was suggested to be used in the classroom as an alternative view of biological evolution. The first time it was going to be used in a public school. Well, the first question is creation science really science? The courts have been here, the U.S. federal courts and the Supreme Court, not the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court and the U.S. federal courts have been there multiple times. It's very clear. Because you masquerade as science doesn't make you scientific. It doesn't make you a lesser form of human inquiry, once again. Theology is important. Philosophy is important. Science is important. But again, they have different modes about asking the questions and different requirements for asking about the natural world. So calling it creation science certainly doesn't make it science, because it doesn't meet the criteria, because it can't explain what is observed without requiring the intervention of a supernatural being. Science can't do that. It's rarely testable against the natural world, which is required by science. If it's rarely testable, it's not potentially falsifiable, which is required by science. And the most important thing, what does intelligent design do in creation science? They say, here's our belief, we'll find the evidence later. That's horse before the cart. One of the great adages in science is that science precedes textbooks and not textbook science. You don't put it in the textbook, then find evidence for it later. You have to earn your way into the classroom. Isn't it fair to produce both sides? This is because we're Americans, right? We want to do everything fair, as is an admirable quality of our society. Isn't it fair that both sides of the issue be presented and let the students decide? Right? This is the argument du jour right now. After all, wouldn't that be the right thing to do? Well, as we know, there are rarely only two sides to any issue. So if in fact our genuine goal is to present the students with all stories of creation, of life on planet, there's a book here by Michael Jordan, different one, now called Gods and Goddesses. It's been renamed several times. The subtitle is a chronicle or a listing of the 2,500 deities of civilization. Most people only want the one with the uppercase G taught, right? Let's forget about the other 2,499. So if really it's quote unquote both sides, wouldn't it be fair to do them all? Would it be pedagogically sound, intellectually honest, to present to science beliefs that really have no scientific evidence? Just because the Flat Earth Society, flatearth.org, Lancaster, California, who would have thought, okay, if you take a look there, they're advocating what? That flat Earth science be presented in the classroom. Well, shouldn't we do that? Why not let the students decide? That's disingenuous, it's dishonest, it's pedagogically unsound because we're offering choices that are not true choices. These are false alternatives from which students will be asked to choose. And that is not right because we're presenting false scientific theories is not an exercise of free thought or academia. It's an exercise in deceptive disservice to the critical thinking and truth in science education. Would it be pedagogically sound to present the following both sides of the story? How about astronomy and astrology? Why not? How about chemistry and alchemy? Why not? How about geography and flat Earth theory? Why not? How about genetics and spontaneous generation? Heliocentrism and geocentrism? Psychology and phrenology, the study of bumps on your head? Some of you guys have some issues I can see from here, okay? Okay? Neurosurgery and reflexology. Don't worry about the tumor, let's just rub your foot, okay? The Holocaust and Holocaust conspiracy. Should the president of Iran be able to introduce his view of the Holocaust? Shouldn't we present both sides? We'd say that's absolutely ridiculous. Well, then why would we teach evolution alongside with creationism? Why is it that the fairness issue is only raised when one of the sides is evolution? And we understand why, don't we? Because as teachers, as professors, this is the only topic we can teach that rocks somebody's worldview, their very existence and their very paradigm of reality. So is there any doubt that there are legions of people out there trying to convince people that evolutionary theory is inappropriate, is invalid science, because it challenges in their minds their view of their life, their view of life on the planet. And I suggest to you, as I did at the beginning, science is one way of knowing. It's encumbered by empiricism, whereas philosophy and theology are not. Can they coexist? Well, the point I've made in my other talks is that if we look at our society today, we are the most scientifically based society that we have ever seen. The number that people like to throw out, if we go back to the first modern scientist, Francis Bacon, we count all scientists who have been alive on the planet, including those alive today, it'd be safe to assume that probably what, 95, 99% of all scientists that have ever been alive on the planet are alive and practicing today. Really? That sounds about right, doesn't it? So we're asking our students to go out and be practitioners of science. Very few of our students will become scientists or science educators. But won't 100% of our students go out and become consumers of science? Look at every day you pick up the paper. You're asked to make some social political decision based upon science, aren't you? Genetic engineering, cloning, global warming, climate change. The list goes on and on. Do we want to send our students out into that scientifically based world without having them understand the most robust, the most widely supported, and the most profound scientific theory that we've ever seen, which is evolutionary biology? Because if they say, when they leave our classrooms, that I don't accept evolutionary theory because it's unfounded science, we have not done our job as science educators. Because as Craig Nelson at University of Indiana University said, evolutionary theory is as good as great science gets. Thanks for your attention.
Any questions or comments? Thanks for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I always enjoy your talk.
Thank you.
My question is, do you have in the book everything you presented tonight, so we can,
Yeah. This will be available on YouTube. You go to YouTube/GRCC and just put in Forbes and you get a gauntlet of Forbes ad nauseum. Okay, so it'll be on there in just a couple days. So this presentation is there, and yes, I have some papers that I can share with you later that I've produced some of this. And also, here's your best resource right here, talkorigins.org. Talkorigins.org has a list of, now probably by conservative estimates, thousands of the anti-evolutionist claims, and they're categorized by geology, by biology, by genetics, and if you can't find it on there, you have a new question that you need to add. But what's nice is the questions are on there and responses from people of authority who should be able to respond to that. This is your one-stop shopping right here at talkorigins.org.
You did say that you'll have this information available shortly. What percentage did you say?
If you go to youtube.com/GRCC, Grand Rapids Community College, and just put Forbes, and a whole bunch of my lectures will come up there. So if you're up at 4 in the morning, you're having a hard time getting to sleep, the dog's still barking, that'll work for you. Thank you.
Top origins lower down, but then it says top origins up there.
Oh, it's missing an I in the URL.
Oh, talk origins, that would work. Thank you for that. Yeah, talk origins.
Who else would like to? Back here.
Hello. I had a question. I almost don't know how to frame it. I understand how it would be politically helpful to say that theology is just as respectable a line of inquiry, but I'm wondering if you sincerely believe that. Because it might be to spare people's feelings, because after all, you're not just preaching to the choir. Your job is to persuade people. You might be just trying to spare people's feelings, but at the same time, they might feel equally insulted if they feel that you're insincere about that.
So you're saying because of my well-known sensitivity and caring, which is typical of my gender, that I might actually be embellishing my true feelings here. Yeah, something like that. No, it depends upon, and thank you for the question, and I think everybody heard that. Really, it depends on what's the question being asked, right? It's the question that's being asked. If the question is there life after death? You know, is there a God? That's completely out of the purview of science. You know, what's the purpose of our being? Completely out of the purview of science. Now, if the question is, you know, when did what we know as the amphibians branch off from the fishes? Am I suggesting that theology is equipped to deal with that? Oh, absolutely not. So it depends which question we're asking. No, this wasn't meant to be same, same, same. There are different purviews for different questions. And there is no better lens to which to examine nature than science. That is the best lens, without a doubt. Is it the only lens? Clearly not. The theologians and philosophers have been doing it even before science got started. Would I suggest that that's the best lens today? Absolutely. Science is, absolutely. So it depends upon the question being asked. Does that respond to the question?
Not really. Your statement that it is theology is just as legitimate a way of inquiry. It wasn't you were saying. Maybe I misunderstood your point, but it sounded like you were saying these fields all deal with different things, and they all deal with them. They're all just equally good. It's just
No.
Let's compartmentalize it.
You know, at the risk of losing the sensitivity of my Y chromosome. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it depends upon the question that's being asked. Am I going to suggest for a second that we should get a philosopher and a theologian to address the question of genomic diversity in the Cretaceous? No, of course not. Am I going to suggest that we get a geneticist to deal with the question of when the apostles first produced whatever, you know, written work they did? No, it depends on what the question is that's being asked. Are they equally equipped to answer the same question? No. Are they equipped to answer distinct questions better than maybe one of the other fields? Yes. Does that work?
Yeah.
Or did I just shoot myself?
No, that's good.
Okay, good.
Getting to your zoology, on Stephen Colbert last night, they had a gentleman who wrote an article that's going to be in the New York Times Magazine, Can Animals Be Gay? Can you respond to that in any way? That was last week, I'm sorry. Yeah.
What's that?
It was last week, I'm sorry. But,
So I don't have to answer the question then. You should have got to me last week. I mean, clearly there's a, yeah. There's a wonderful book out by a zoologist called Biological Exuberance. which deals with that exact topic. We see, let's just use the term homosexual activity. It's very well known in vertebrates. It's very well known for a variety of different behavioral reasons. So it's been documented for a very long time. Nothing new in the biological radar there. Yeah.
But calling it homosexual activity could be just anthropomorphic.
Sure.
Because it's from our frame of reference.
Oh, sure. Well, let's choose the term we want. But of course, if we say gay, lesbian, straight, it's loaded with human terms, isn't it? So if we look at homosexual activity, what appears to be sexual activity with same sex, there's the frame that we're using. Well known in vertebrates. Absolutely. For a bunch of reasons.
What does a typical intro to biology course look like from beginning of the year to end of the year as far as dealing with this issue with students?
Yeah.
How many of them, how much time does it take in class, that sort of thing?
What we've done, the question is that, and now, for the folks that are sitting here tonight, of course, we're here in West Michigan, and we're our own kind of special little enclave, a little oasis in A, Michigan, and B, the Midwest. So we have some different types of challenges and opportunities in the classroom in Michigan. But what we have done at the college in the classes that we teach in our department for our general biology classes, we've actually made the entire theme of the course evolutionary biology. The entire course and all topics revolve around evolutionary theory, and that's very common nationally now. And we find that our students are very receptive because once again it gets back to, and getting back to Jeremy's question, are we really just trying to be PC by saying they're separate forms of human inquiry? You get nowhere on this topic if you say initially is that science is all there is. There is no other way to look at the world around us. Everybody's just, you know, they folded their chairs and they're going home. If we look at it saying that we're going to be discussing science in this class, here's how we define science, here's the purview of science, here's the nature of science, here's the limitation of science, and that's the scope of our talk, then we don't get the body language, we don't get the letters, etc. And we find the students are willing to come along with us, especially when we have our teachers understand that our goal as teachers is not to change the world paradigm or view of the students in the classroom. Our goal is to expose them to modern science. What they do with it in their own life is their decision. Because what we try and do, right, is not teach students what to think. We try and teach them how to think, right? We give them the tools to do that. So we try and equip them with the knowledge of science. And we find out as we get through the semester, we have a lot of commentary from students, especially in the Midwest, who say, I've A, never been exposed to this before, and B, what I thought I knew isn't true, and C, this makes a lot of sense, and sometimes D, this is a little disturbing in my own personal view of life, and they need to deal with that. For some students, that's a very difficult thing to do.
Any final question or comment? We'll take one more over here, and then we'll wrap up.
You stated that the female reproductive system pretty much sucks, but have we gone through any evolutionary changes to fix it? And if we haven't, why haven't we?
Yeah. Let me change the syntax here, so I know I'll get emails, okay? There was a better way to design the female reproductive tract. Is that, in a quickie, one of my anatomy students asking the questions here, is that the female reproductive tract, the ovaries, the uterus, the cervix, everything is what we call retroperitoneal. If you open up the abdominal cavity, it's not there. It's behind a tissue. Everything is, except where the oviduct meets the ovary. It does open into the abdominal cavity. What's up with that, okay? That means that cells, for instance, from the uterus can now make it up into the abdominal cavity, producing what? Endometriosis. Cells can land up on top of the ovaries, producing what? Ovarian cyst. Fertilized eggs can land on the intestines, producing ectopic intestinal pregnancies. Not in the intestine, you don't defecate the child, okay? It's on the intestines in the abdominal cavity, and also can produce, the list just goes on, pelvic inflammatory disease. All it would be required is a tiny piece of tissue right over that junction, and none of it. Well, because evolution doesn't work towards a goal. Right? These people think, well, you know, evolution works towards a goal. Evolution, and the process by which it works, natural selection, is not goal-oriented. So you don't have sponges on the rocks going, gotta be a human, wanna be a human, have to be a human, right? Okay? You know, okay, it doesn't work that way. If you have mutations that can produce these mutations and they're positive, then that may be selected for and conserved. It's kind of like, why are most of you sporting 28 teeth in your head rather than the 32 that emerged? Well, because your hominid ancestors, which were primarily herbivorous, had longer mandibles and maxilla in proportion to the skull than you do. You know, now that we're omnivorous, we don't need all those fat grinding surfaces. You say, well, then why haven't we just lost those teeth? Because that's something in evolution we call Lamarckianism. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, use what God gave you, it will rust, use it or lose it. No, just because it's not a benefit doesn't mean it's going to go away. Think of in-laws. Okay? Sorry. Okay. Can we edit that part out? Okay, so might you see in another 100 years, 5,000 years, we're having this talk that has evolved over that? Sure, it could go the other way too, right?
So we're still screwed.
Again, we're changing the syntax with content to this, but it's something that we've learned to deal with, haven't we, in female reproduction. And there are a lot of goofy things in the human body. The list goes on and on of, if you were an engineer, you would never design it from that way up, okay? The human eye. I mean, the list goes on and on. Anybody who's over 30 knows this all too well. Because after 30, it's like Star Trek. Hey, Captain, we're breaking up and there's nothing we can do. It's to hell in a handbag after 30, isn't it? Good night. Thanks for coming.